Yeah, welcome in. Welcome back to another episode of the Format Podcast. Yes. And got a pretty interesting show for you here today. Actually, part of it is a bit of a throwback. So we're going to get into that in just a moment. We're going to talk about Steph Curry eclipsing the 4,000 made three-pointers mark in his career, which is absolutely phenomenal. And even more so considering he's got more time to go. But before we get to that, you know what time it is. If you're watching here on YouTube, make sure you go ahead, click that subscribe, that like, that notification bell. Make sure you're kept aware anytime we drop new content on the channel. If you want the audio-only version of the podcast, open up your audio podcast platform, hit the search bar, type in The Format Podcast, and we should come right up. If you enjoy the content as you listen, make sure you give us a like, a 5-star review, and drop a comment. All that stuff helps us rise in the algorithm, helps us find more sports fans, helps more sports fans find us. And write it down, put it in your phones, make a note of it. The Format Podcast is live Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. Eastern. And finally, if you're really and truly enjoying the podcast and you want to help the show continue to grow, make sure you go ahead, click that join button, join the channel. We're going to have some exclusive content just for you. All right, guys. So let's do this. As I mentioned before in the intro, Steph Curry recently surpassed the 4,000 made three-pointers mark, with further extending himself as, I'm not going to say the greatest, but I will say the most prolific shooter in the history of the National Basketball Association. He's well ahead of his next closest guy. I think James Harden is number 2 overall, just recently passed the great Ray Allen. But you know, a big part of that is not necessarily that guys are better shooters. As I always say, imagine if the guys from back in the day, the shooters from back in the day that is played today, had the rules the way they are today, the way the game is played today, and, you know, the green light from coaches to shoot 10, 15 threes a game if they're quality shooters. So we got to take that into account regardless. Steph is, without question, one of the greatest shooters of all time. But we keep hearing that Steph Curry is the greatest shooter of all time. And I have some questions about that. So in thinking about that and doing regular audits of the channel, which I normally do, I actually went back and looked through and I found a show that I did, I guess the year, maybe 2023, which would be the year following Steph Curry's most recent championship. So this was a show that I did actually discussing this very topic. So I wanted to bring it back, dust it off, remix it a little bit, and deliver it to you guys, because I'm sure that it would be something that you might be interested in hearing and might be interested in seeing. But, you know, this is not me taking a shot at Steph Curry. This is just asking the question, because there are a lot of incredible shooters that came before. So, you know, you want to know, like, is he definitively the greatest shooter of all time? I don't think we'll ever be able to say. What we can say without question, is that he's certainly the most prolific. So let's go. Let me take you back to the show we did previously, and we'll talk about that. All right. Is Steph Curry really the one? We often talk about Steph Curry as the greatest shooter of all time. And let's be real here. There have been a ton of great shooters throughout the history of the NBA. You know, your Del Curry, Steph Curry's dad. He wasn't a superstar, but he was a great shooter. You have your Ricky Pierces, your Glenn Rices, your Peja Stojakovic's. I can go on and on. Your Drazen Petrovic's. Of course, Larry Bird, Damian Lillard, Ray Allen, Reggie Miller, Klay Thompson. Those last 5 guys are generally the guys that are kind of brought up most in the greatest shooter of all time discussion. But most people hold Stephen Curry as kind of having that mythical title of being the greatest shooter of all time. He's made the most threes in NBA history. He's definitely the most prolific shooter. He literally, since he's come into the league, has changed the way the game is played in terms of the volume of three-point attempts guys are taking, the range with which guys are shooting, how guys are shooting, all of that. And we'll get to that in a minute, but he's generally thought of as the greatest shooter of all time because he's almost the perfect mix of all those things, right? He can catch and shoot. He can shoot off the dribble. He can shoot with tremendous range. He's good in the mid-range. He's tremendous at the free throw line. So he's got all of these things together. But where it kind of counts most, at least for most people, is that he's not great in the clutch. So now the question is, even despite all the characteristics that he does possess as a shooter, not being great in the clutch, does that disqualify him from the greatest shooter of all time argument? And last night on The Odd Couple on Fox Sports Radio with Rob Parker and Chris Broussard, they got into it a little bit, and Rob Parker's for a long time he's been on the soapbox about Steph Curry not being the greatest shooter of all time. Let's hear what those two guys have to say about it.
What'd you think, of the game? Were you surprised? Were you know?
The only thing that jumped out to me was, I told you about Steph Curry.
Oh,
I told you.
What's there to tell?
That he can't make a big shot. Chris, he had a chance to tie the game. He had an open look at the end of the game. Where's Steph with the dipsy doodle?
He was two dudes.
He
was two guys.
Chris, he got a good look at that. He had a shot.
It was a good look, but it wasn't an open look.
In the NBA, he got a clear look at the basket, and once again, he didn't make it. I think he's now 0 for 10 with a chance to tie or win a game in the playoffs with less than 10 seconds. This is your greatest shooter of all time that you guys keep talking about. Let me give you more numbers.
Absolutely.
Steph Curry is 6 for 23 in his career on all shots in the final 1 minute of playoff games to tie or take the lead. Did you hear me? The greatest shooter of all time, according to Chris Broussard and those other Curry minions, is 6 for 23, including just 3 for 13 from 3. So he can make the logo 3. He can make the three-quarter 3 when it doesn't matter. But when it matters, give me Reggie Miller. Give me Ray Allen. Give me any of those guys. Give me Michael Jordan. Anybody but Steph Curry in a big moment. And we saw what happened. We also saw history repeat itself, Chris, when we talked about the road, how bad they were. Everybody, the playoffs come. They'll just get it together and change things up, and they'll be okay.
They won 4 of their last 5 games on the road.
That's nice. But they look like that team. They struggled. They
didn't struggle. They lost by 3 points.
They were up at the half
with 10 seconds left.
They were up at the half.
Right.
Chris,
So
they had a nice lead. Yeah.
That's struggling.
In the second half, they couldn't finish the game.
Had a chance to win. That's struggling.
They couldn't.
They were supposed to lose.
No, they weren't.
They're facing the 3rd seed at home.
No, they weren't. They won the championship a year ago. They have Steph Curry, the greatest shooter of all time. How many times are you guys going to finally buy into it? You can't be the greatest shooter of all time if you never made a big shot.
So there you heard it. Rob Parker is adamant that Steph Curry's lack of big game shot making and big, playoff environment, NBA Finals, clutch shooting kind of takes him out of the greatest shooter of all time argument. So this is really interesting because, as I mentioned, there's a lot of reasons why you could have him as the greatest shooter of all time. But we're going to talk about some of those guys I mentioned, those last 5 guys that kind of are the main people in the argument for greatest shooter of all time. And I'm going to start with Larry Legend himself, Larry Bird. Now, the percentages aren't that great for him. And despite what JJ Redick had to say about it just being a function of math, percentages, makes, volumes, and attempts, it's just not that simple. When you boil it down to today's analytics-driven game, I get why he would want to say that. And again, I discussed this on a previous episode. The fact that he played in this era, he wants to protect this era, and he's been conditioned by the way the game is played and the way the game is trained and the way the game is measured in terms of success in the analytics-driven format. He doesn't believe that Larry Bird is the greatest shooter of all time. Now, a lot of people do in terms of his ability to make huge shots when it's needed. Larry Bird was just a shade under 90% from the free throw line for his career. And for each of these, I'm not going to run down all the stats for you because that would be the easy way to do it. But that takes away so much from really identifying how great they are, because a bunch of numbers is just that, right? We know stats and analytics don't always tell the story. So Larry Bird, I want to say just under 38% all-time three-point shooter. He's just under 90% from the free throw line. Just an outstanding shooter in the mid-range. As I mentioned, great from the free throw line, very, very good from 3. But he had some bad seasons from 3. And for his career, he's only 32% from the three-point line in the playoffs. Now, with that said, Bird made a lot of huge threes,
but he didn't have that super high percentage. So, you know, if you're driven by the numbers, you're going to say, well, Bird wasn't and shouldn't be in the greatest shooter of all time argument. But if you saw him play, and even if you go back, watch on YouTube, Larry Bird highlights and clips like what I'm showing here that you're seeing as I'm talking, or if you will listen to the stories told by his competitors, they'll tell you how afraid they were of leaving Larry Bird alone to shoot, because this is a guy that's going to tell you where he's going to shoot it from, how he's going to shoot it, what type of shot it is, and then he's going to knock it down. He's going to tell you about that too. Larry Bird, one of the greatest shooters of all time. Is he the greatest? I don't know. The point of this show is not really to decide who's the greatest shooter of all time, but just to kind of talk about the topic. From today's era, Damian Lillard. This is a guy, Logo Lillard, right? This is a guy that kind of followed in Steph's footsteps in terms of just absolutely incredible, what we call parking lot range. Pretty much as soon as he steps off the bus, he's a threat to make it, right? We've seen Lillard pull up and shoot from ridiculous distances constantly. We've also seen him make huge shots in the playoffs. One being obviously the shot that he made to send Paul George home, I think the year before the bubble, to send Paul George home in the OK City Thunder when, he pulled up almost from logo distance with Paul George defending him. Paul George had afterwards said, it was a bad shot, but it went in. And most people would say, yeah, it was a bad shot. But Lillard has no problem and no lack of confidence in taking a shot like that and making a shot like that. He's another guy. He's a tremendous three-point shooter. I want to say, as a matter of fact, he holds the playoff record for most made threes in a playoff game with 12. So we know that he can knock those things down in big-time moments. Again, much like Bird, not a tremendous career three-point percentage. I want to say he's like 37% for his career. But this is a guy who can make a ton of shots and make huge shots when his team needs them. Okay. All right. Moving on. Ray Allen, the guy who Steph Curry broke the record for most made career three-pointers. Ray Allen, Seattle Supersonics, Milwaukee Bucks, drafted by the Bucks. So first the Milwaukee Bucks, then the Seattle Supersonics, then Boston Celtics, and then, of course, the Miami Heat. Ray Allen, the numbers say it themselves, right? He's 40% from three from his career. Again, another outstanding free throw shooter, another guy outstanding in the mid-range, because when he came into the league, guys were still really shooting the mid-range, but just an outstanding three-point shooter. And we know also made one of the biggest, if not the biggest shots in NBA Finals history, one that saved LeBron in 2013 by, Chris Bosh gets the tap out. Ray Allen grabs the rebound, makes sure he gets behind the three-point line and knocks down an incredible three-point shot to send the game into overtime. Arguably the greatest clutch shot in NBA Finals history. It's either that one or the one Kyrie Irving made in 2016 to help complete the comeback against Golden State, right? So Ray Allen, just an incredible shooter, made tons of huge shots in his career for the Celtics, made tons of huge shots in his career for Milwaukee, for the Supersonics, and of course, as I mentioned just now, the Miami Heat. Next up, Reggie Miller. Again, not necessarily the percentages that we're used to seeing from today, because guys didn't shoot the three quite as much, but still just an incredible shooter and a tremendous sense for the drama of making huge shots. Most well-known probably for his incredible shooting against the Knicks in the playoffs in Madison Square Garden. I want to say 1994. Yep, 1994 in the fourth quarter of one of the playoff games against the Knicks. He hits 5 threes. He's in a war of words with Spike Lee, and he's pulling up from what at that time was crazy range. Reggie Miller wasn't nearly as good as the last two guys I mentioned in terms of off the dribble, but Reggie Miller was one of the greatest ever on the catch and shoot, moving without the basketball, catching it, shooting it, and making shots. And Reggie really had the stones, right? When it came to a big shot in a big moment, he wanted it for his team. When he first got there to Indiana, Chuck Person, a guy you may or may not have heard of, he was nicknamed the Rifleman, and he was a great shooter, and then Reggie kind of took over from him and became the guy in those huge moments. So from the Rifleman, Chuck Person, and then on to Reggie Miller. But Reggie Miller made huge shot after huge shot. So I just mentioned the 25 points in the fourth quarter of, I believe it was game 5 in 1994 against the Knicks. The Pacers come back against the Knicks, play them again in the playoffs in 1995. I believe it was game 1. He has the incredible 8 points in the last 9 seconds to steal the game. He comes down, hits a 3, steals the inbounds pass at the end of that game, gets behind the 3-point line, knocks down another 3, and then he ends up getting fouled and sinking 2 free throws. Just another incredible clutch shooting display. And if you remember in the clip that I played at the beginning of this episode, Rob Parker says, in a clutch moment, give me Reggie Miller any day over Steph Curry. And, there may be some argument for that. Next up, the other Splash brother, Klay Thompson, who now currently holds the record for most 3-point attempts in a game. Now, let me mention real quick, Ray Allen, Reggie Miller, Larry Bird, any one of these guys could have held that record. It's just that, again, the 3-pointer wasn't quite as prevalent during their eras as it is now. So guys didn't necessarily have the green light to be pulling from anywhere on the floor at any given time, right? Even though they were great shooters. But regardless, Klay Thompson has 14 made threes in a game. That's currently the record. He also has games where he's made 12 and 13 threes in a game. So Klay Thompson is a lights out shooter. That's why he and Steph are known as the Splash Brothers, right? Because it's water when they shoot. And between the two of them, they are easily the most prolific shooting backcourt in the history of the NBA. I mean, there's no arguing that, no matter what you think, no matter what you say about the rules, no matter about the style of play, pace play, whatever. Those two guys are two of the greatest shooters ever to do it. Klay Thompson, he just knocks that thing down. I mean, he is a shooter. I want to say there's a game, Klay Thompson, I believe he had 60. And the crazy thing was him, much like Reggie Miller, is not the greatest shooter off the dribble. So he's a tremendous catch and shoot guy. And I want to believe in that game, he hit, I think he hit like 11 threes or 13 threes. And he only took like 30 dribbles the whole game. Like he was catching the thing, maybe one dribble, an escape dribble, and then he was pulling up. Like it was incredible. I think he has a 33 or 37 point quarter, which is also an NBA record. I mean, Klay Thompson is just phenomenal when it comes to shooting the ball. So between him and Steph Curry, that's a nightmare for any defense to deal with. And they are an absolutely gargantuan part of why the Golden State Warriors have 4 championships in the last 8 seasons, right? Because of the Splash Brothers and the way the game is played and how these guys can shoot the ball. Now, Steph Curry, we talked about this earlier. He is just a ridiculous shooter, ridiculous in terms of range, ridiculous on the catch and shoot, ridiculous off the dribble, because he's also a tremendous ball handler, right? He's also ridiculous in that he's a threat to pass the ball. And with his ball handling skills, he's a threat to go past you and score at the rim. He can shoot in the mid-range. So he's got all these incredible aspects to his game. But again, the problem is, and you heard the stats from Rob Parker, he is not great in the clutch. So how can you be the greatest shooter of all time? I'm not saying he is, I'm not saying he isn't, but how can you be the greatest shooter of all time if you don't have those shots in the clutch? Because those are huge, and those are a huge part of any shooter's resume, any shooter's legend, Larry Legend, right? Any shooter's mythos. All this stuff comes from making those huge shots in the clutch. Think about it. We talked about Larry Bird, his huge shots in the playoffs. We talked about Lillard literally sending guys home with shots in the playoffs. We talked about Ray Allen saving a championship in the playoffs with one of the 2 biggest shots in the history of the NBA Finals. We talked about Reggie Miller. He had a shot to beat Michael Jordan. They ended up losing that. I want to say the 1998 Eastern Conference Finals. Reggie Miller knocked down a shot at the end of either game 4 or game 5 on Michael Jordan to win that game. It went to 7, and of course the Bulls ended up winning. But the point is, Reggie Miller, he had that flair for the dramatic as well. We talked about his incredible shooting against the Knicks in the playoffs. And of course, we have game 6 Klay Thompson, who is known for his heroics as well. So all these guys are on the list in terms of greatest shooter of all time. So what I want to know from you is Steph Curry the greatest shooter of all time in your estimation? If he's not, who do you think it is? And what do you think goes into being the greatest shooter of all time? All right, thanks so much for checking in with me. Can't wait to hear back from you. And I'll be back next episode. And I'm out. Peace.